Nigeria's private sector experienced concerns over the trade restrictions and logistics challenges that have been hindering the country from harnessing the potential of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Despite the immense benefits of the agreement, Nigeria has not been able to fully take advantage of it. That, of course, is the agreement and the barriers that have been associated with its trade with other African countries. Now, AfCFTA advocates the dropping of about 90% of tariffs and includes policies aimed at eliminating non-tariff barriers such as customs and other delays that might be affecting its revenue and its trade operations with other West African countries. So this morning from Accra, Ghana, I'm being joined by Demitta Gyang, who is the head Customs Cooperation, Trade Facilitation and Transit, AfCFTA. Thank you so much, Demitta, for talking to us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we've seen the private sector, the private sector in Nigeria complaining bitterly about issues as regards logistics and, of course, trade restrictions that is in place as regards the non-barriers and barriers affecting trade relations with other African countries. I'd like to find out from you what these barriers are and why is it an impediment to the full utilization of the AfCFTA?
Oh, well, thank you very much for that question. In terms of non-tariff barriers and tariffs, if you might recall, the AfCFTA significantly, the first goal is the liberalization, which is the removal of tariffs between the signatory countries. The AfCFTA is meant to liberalize, in the first instance, about 90% of the tariff lines, but over a period of time, over a period of 10 years for least developed countries and a period of 5 years for developing countries. But then you will notice that in trade, that when tariffs go, there is usually a rise in non-tariff barriers. I'll break it down this way. Non-tariff barriers is every other barrier that is not tariff, okay? If you look at the fact that you need to pay a tariff to trade, you will look at it from that barrier point of view. So every other rule, regulation that you might have to meet before trading your goods can easily be classed under non-tariff barriers. Let me give you an example. So a very easy example of a non-tariff barrier that you might face in cross-border trade. And so I give you an example based on the Abidjan-Lagos corridor. There is what you call a language barrier along that corridor. I'm taking this very simplistic one. It appears very simple, but it is an issue. So when you are crossing the border and you move from Nigeria that is English speaking, and then you move into Benin that is French speaking, all the documents that you have done in English would have to be translated to French for the Beninois officers to be able to work on it, and vice versa. And then if you are looking at the stretch of the Abidjan-Lagos corridor, you realize that you will encounter this severally. So you go from Nigeria to Benin, then you go from Benin to Togo. That's okay. They both speak the same language. And then you move from Togo to Ghana, it has to change. And then you move from Ghana to Cote d'Ivoire, it has to change. So this is but a little example of what a non-tariff barrier could be. It could also be licensing requirements. It could also be transport standards, differing between the countries. It could also be rules around the sanitary and phytosanitary measures. It could also be rules around the technical barriers to trade. These rules in themselves can be legitimate, right? But the way they are implemented or enforced might constitute a non-tariff barrier, especially when it costs the trader time and money that is not necessary in this committing. Thank you.
Let's critically look at it, Demitta. Nigeria's tariffs are determined by the ECOWAS 2015 to 2019 Common External Tariff. Now, the tariff has 5 bands, and I'll just roll it out. 0% duty on capital goods and essential drugs, 5% duty on raw materials, 10% on intermediate goods, 20% on finished goods, and 35% on imports into strategic sectors. Now, in your own view, as you have said that it might be necessary, and some others might say it probably might not be necessary because of the restrictions and all the baggages that come with it. Are there any justifications for these trade restrictions now that we are talking about AfCFTA?
Okay, so when you look at the AfCFTA, what happened within the AfCFTA is that there were agreed modalities for tariff reduction. And ECOWAS, being a customs union, because it has this common external tariff, submitted a single harmonized schedule to the AfCFTA. And in this schedule, within this 0 to 35 band that you have described, would eventually come to zero for the AfCFTA trade, right? So, so that's the first restriction to trade that is being removed by the AfCFTA, the tariffs, right? And so this the schedule is submitted in such a way that these tariffs will be phased out on 90% of these goods within 10 years for ECOWAS. And an additional 7% will be phased out over a longer period, which is 13 years for ECOWAS. So by 2033, since the implementation started 2021, by 2033, you are looking at 97% of those tariffs being zero. Only 3 excluded from these tariffs to give countries some room for policy in terms of goods that they really don't want to liberalize. So 97% of the tariffs based on the current modalities for the AfCFTA will go to zero in 2033. Regarding other restrictions regarding the non-tariff barriers, the AfCFTA also aims to eliminate progressive elimination of non-tariff barriers. And studies have shown that if these non-tariff barriers are eliminated by countries, it would add 52% to intra-Africa trade, if not more.
Well, then we know that tariffs are actually being used to actually generate funds for governments and to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. But now that the AfCFTA is looking at eliminating the tariff barriers by about 90%, you are saying that probably might just be phased to about 0%. How do we now strike a balance between these two?
Yeah, so tariffs are a source of revenue. But then there are other sources of revenue to a government, for instance, VAT, right? Local taxes. So in terms of increasing trade, tariffs are usually a big barrier to increasing trade. And if you remove the tariffs, you create more trade. And the logic is that if you create more trade, you create more wealth, and if you create more wealth, you would be able to use this wealth in other areas in order to raise revenue for a government significantly. So it is removing one source of revenue, but then in that removal of that one source of revenue, you create many other sources of revenue for a government. And in terms of trade liberalization, what governments usually do, because tariff laws can be significant for some countries. But then if you look at what we are doing within the AfCFTA, if you remember the logic behind the AfCFTA, that logic is that we don't trade much with ourselves. So it is not really from ourselves that these tariffs have been coming. It's been coming from the rest of the world. Because if you look at intra-Africa trade, it's insignificant at 16%. And so if you do remove these tariffs, you still have your trade with the rest of the world, which you can take tariffs from. And then you will be creating more trade amongst yourself. And this creation of more trade amongst yourself would actually lead to welfare gain. UNCTAD had actually estimated the welfare gains that will accrue to the African countries for the removal of these tariffs.
So does the double taxation treaties that Nigeria has with other non-African countries like China, France, Spain, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and some other countries, is there any correlation between this trade, most especially the double taxation treaties, and of course what the AfCFTA provides? Are there any correlation as regards that?
The AfCFTA agreement sets out. Well, first, it's the rules-based trade governance system. It's a set of rules that member states of the African Union came together to say these rules will now govern our trade within the continent. And in that set of rules, it does also set out what our engagement is with third parties. That's parties that are not African Union member states and therefore not parties to the preference area. And what it does set out is in terms of what prevails in terms of a conflict regarding whatever agreements that a country that is a member of the AfCFTA has. And so if you go to the rules, it actually tells you what happens if these are agreements that existed before the AfCFTA. Of course, there is that principle in international law that you don't use a new agreement to escape your obligations in another agreement. But then, from the time the AfCFTA came into force, it is expected that the AfCFTA will take that preference over any other agreements that any of our member states might enter into. And so the AfCFTA basically deals with tariffs, not double taxation in taxation in the sense that you have mentioned it. It is actually in terms of tariffs that we do share with one another within the continent.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was nice to have gotten that clarification from you, Demitta Chinwude, Gyang, Head Customs Corporation, Trade Facilitation and Transit, AfCFTA. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Now, Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, signed the AfCFTA on July 7, 2019, becoming the 34th member of the trading bloc. Now, in the light of the foregoing limitations, stakeholders and the private sector have called on the governments to remove trade barriers and boost implementation through the provision of infrastructure and other amenities that might help. So let's see how the AfCFTA would help drive economic growth, not only for Nigeria, but then for the West African countries and beyond. Thank you so much for joining us on today's edition of Business Edge. Tomorrow is another time, 11 a.m. West African time, right here on New Central Television. Don't forget to visit our social media handles, that is at New Central TV. Download our mobile app on App Store and Play Store, and also visit our website, www.newcentral.africa. I am Lekan Onabanjo. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay with us for the news at the top of the hour.